the response to my proposal of new structural economics is much better than I expected. I find that people started to use this as a framework to do their research, and then some government also use this as a way to design their policies. First, African countries' government, like Ethiopia, Rwanda, Tanzania, they already implement some of my recommendations. And in effect, they even see the result yet. Like in Ethiopia, they follow the recommendation to promote the building up of their leather shoe sectors by attracting the direct investment from China. And within 1 year, they already see the result. More than double their leather shoes export, and already employ more than 2,000 workers in the sectors within 1 year. And not only in African countries, the Central Asia countries and Latin America countries are also interested in this framework. The existing economic theories are proposed by economists in high-income countries. And in high-income countries, the industrial development follow more the spontaneous process. And under the kind of situation, only wealthy firms will be there. But in the transition economies, because the government in the past wants to build up the advanced capital-intensive sectors, which are not consistent with their country's competitive advantages. Firms in those kind of sectors were not viable. And also the governments in the transition economies, before the transition, gave a lot of supports, protection to those kind of firms. And when the transition started, and the theory that borrowed from the high-income country did not pay attention to, in effect, those firms was the result of the government direct support and protection. And so when they apply those kind of theory, then if the government wants to remove all the protection subsidy and so on, those firms will go bankrupt. And that is one of the main constraints that the Washington consensus type of reform did not work well. So what I propose in the new structural economics is to look at what the developing countries have now, what they can do well based on what they have now, and scale up what they can do well. And if they can do that, certainly they will have more success. They will have higher confidence on their own abilities, and they can build up their capacity by this kind of virtuous reinforcement.
What I'm concerned about, if I look at CIS and also other parts of Central Eastern Europe, like in the Balkans, is that not every country and not every region is following that pattern. You see quite strong disparities across the region. So I think to some extent the situation is rather different from the field which probably Justin has in mind as countries which have a complete, relatively strong control over their own destiny here. Like China, India in some way. They are embedded in the international economy, but the national policy tools are there to guide the economy and to guide economic structural policy. In Central Eastern Europe and the Balkans, of course, the degree of international integration, the influence of foreign investment are such strong agents and forming features that you can't just see it in the same terms as you could see it in the more traditional setting of developing countries where a strong national policy effort drives policy making. The Bruegel report was in a sense an effort by our two institutes, the Vienna Institute for International Economic Studies and the Bruegel Institute in Brussels, to come to terms of the impact of the recent economic and financial crisis on Central Eastern Europe. And I think it was one of the first reports which pointed out the very strong distortions which evolved prior to the crisis in some of the regions of lower middle income countries across Europe. It's not only Central Eastern Europe, but also in Southern Europe. By now it is commonplace that people point out that there were unsustainable developments of credit, debt developments by the private sector. We also pointed out that the problems were much more with private debt development rather than fiscal problems, which at that time was a rather specific comments to make. And the other thing, of course, is that we also pointed very strongly towards the unsustainable external imbalances which developed prior to the crisis and which will need to go through a very strong adjustment. So I think we didn't necessarily point so much to national policy failures, but the failures in terms of the European integration setting, which led to this very strong runaway developments of private sector debt, external imbalances in these countries, and therefore would need a dramatic adjustment to take place afterwards. Well, new structural economics, as far as I could see it, is less located in the domain of macroeconomic policy analysis, where you think about issues of overall trade balances, savings rates, the development of the relationship between financial system and macroeconomic variables such as financing situations of the public sector or the private sector, etc. So I would see the two could be quite complementary in a sense that what we were pointing out is in a more traditional macroeconomic analysis setting, what sort of problems of internal and external imbalances could take place in a scenario of very strong financial integration, which took place in Europe prior to the crisis. A very strong presence of foreign banks, not sufficient cross-border regulation and monitoring, etc. Yeah? So these are issues which, as far as I can see, are not as emphasized or integrated into the analysis of new structural economics.
Even the most advanced countries, the ones that are in the European Union, still face transition challenges in certain sectors, and for that reason we at the EBRD are still active in those countries, although we do hope and expect that in the due course of time they will graduate from EBRD operations. But I think if you do a detailed sectoral analysis of each country and of the challenges they face, you can find areas where they still lag behind best practice, best international standards, behind the standards of this hypothetical advanced market economy that we've been aiming towards really since the EBRD began. We are active in 3 countries in North Africa now: Egypt, Morocco and Tunisia, and also Jordan in the Middle East. And what we have learned so far is a lot of the challenges are similar to those in our traditional region of operations, and their level of transition is broadly similar to perhaps a country like Kazakhstan or Ukraine. But one striking difference in a lot of these countries is the again, it goes back to this point about inclusion and the inclusion gap, and particularly the high levels of social inequality and high levels of youth unemployment. So in our projects there, we will, I think, be looking particularly to try and not just have our traditional transition impact through our projects, but also to help improve equality of opportunity for some of these excluded groups. I think the transition agenda and the associated research agenda has evolved over time, and it has evolved in a way much more towards looking at political economy aspects and looking at the role of deeper structural reforms and the role of institutions in a country's development and in a country's growth. So the new transition report that you mentioned, which we're preparing now and will be published later in the year, has a very strong political economy flavor. It's really looking at why some countries get stuck in transition, why political institutions develop well in some countries and not in others, and why there's such big institutional variation across countries. We will also be looking closely at the role of inclusion. It's a topic that we're increasingly focused on at the EBRD. How do we broaden opportunities for groups of the population that up to now have been largely excluded from the benefits of transition? That will feature prominently in the report as well. I'm still trying to fully understand what new structural economics is about. I see a lot of common themes. Certainly the role of the market is one, the emphasis on comparative advantage, the emphasis on reforms more generally. So let's see. I think it's been a very useful, certainly a very useful dialogue in this conference, and it's one that will continue.